Verse 13 of Luke 14 says, when you give a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the lame, and the blind, and thou shalt be blessed, for they can't pay you. Isn't that good? They can't pay you. They can't buy a ticket. And God will bless you. That was Paul's manner. In Acts 20, he says, I worked. When I ministered to you, he says to the Ephesian elders, verses 33 and 34, I worked. And not only did I supply my own living, so you didn't have to pay me, but I supplied the living of everybody who worked with me. Now that's hard work, isn't it? Fourth, another exchange. He says the new man will exchange in another category. Corrupt communication will be exchanged for edifying words. This is very practical. Verse 29, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. Now, I'll be very frank with you. Nothing is more distasteful to me than filthy communication. I just really can't tolerate that. I don't like that. I don't want to be a part of that. I don't like to be around that. That's not something that interests me. By the way, it says no corrupt communication. Corrupt is sapros, it means rotten. And it has to do with something that is worthless and useless, that is diseased. A rotten vegetable or a rotten fruit is something that is useless and worthless. It smells, it is offensive, it doesn't do anything for anybody. In fact, you don't want to get near it, let alone eat it. That kind of talk has no place. Whether it's off-color jokes, profanity, dirty stories, crude things, there's no place in the life of a Christian for that stuff. Let me give you a verse to remember. Psalm 141:3. Mark it down. Psalm 141:3 says, set a watch, O Lord, before my mouth and keep the door of my lips. Listen, if Jesus Christ is the doorkeeper of your lips, then He'll be the one who determines what comes out. There's no place for corrupt communication. I'm not interested in off-color jokes and dirty stories. I'm not interested in innuendo and double entendre. I'm not interested in outright crude and dirty and talk. That doesn't interest me at all. Colossians talks about that. And the Apostle Paul in chapter 3, talking about killing all the old things, says, verse 8, put off filthy communication out of your mouth. No place for that. You know what? When anybody talks like that, it's pretty obvious what's going on, because Matthew chapter 12 says, out of the abundance of the heart, what? The mouth speaks. And you can tell a lot about somebody's heart by what comes out of their mouth. In chapter 5 of Ephesians, look over in the next page, verse 3, fornication, uncleanness, covetousness, let it not be once named among you. I mean, once it shouldn't even be there. Neither should filthiness nor foolish talking. There's no place for dirty talk, filthy or foolish, obscene talk. And you know, in Romans chapter 3, when it discusses the depravity of man, it shows how man's depravity starts from inside and it comes up through his mouth and his tongue and his lips and it comes out. Get rid of all that. And in its place, here's what you do. 3 features of the speech of the new man. Verse 29. First, it should be edifying, which is good for edifying. Good for edifying. Whenever you talk, if the Lord is keeping watch over your lips and you open your mouth, whatever comes out should build other people up. Edifying means building up. It should build them up. It should be encouraging. It should be strengthening. It should be spiritually edifying, spiritually positive, spiritually strengthening, spiritually building them up. Is that what happens when you talk? When you pass by someone and they talk with you for a matter of a few moments, do they go away built up in Jesus Christ? Do they go away edified in Jesus Christ? Is that what it is that happens? And all around the house during the day, Mom, when you're with your kids, is what you say that which edifies and builds up? Dad, when you take your sons out and you spend a day with them, when you talk to them, is what happens edifying and building and strengthening and encouraging to them? Secondly, it ought to be necessary. It says in verse 29, the little phrase, to the use. And literally it means as it fits the need. As it fits the need. Listen, my mom used to say to me when I was a kid, I'd start to say to him, hey Mom, do you know what so-and-so? And she'd say, now is that necessary? Is that necessary? It's interesting. Don't know whether it's necessary, but is it necessary? If we just said what was edifying and necessary, people would flock to be near us. Third, gracious. The end of verse 29, that it may serve grace to the hearers. It's just like coming out like a waiter and giving them a feast of grace. Is there sweetness in what you say that blesses and ingratiates? You know, every time you open your mouth, it should be building, it should be fitting, and it should be gracious. That's the way we ought to talk. That's what ought to come out of our mouths, not filthy communication. We have a new heart, and out of the abundance of a new heart should come a new speech. I love what it says in Luke 4:22. And everybody bore Jesus witness and wondered at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. Oh, I love that. When Jesus opened his mouth, graciousness came out. And when he spoke, it was edifying, it was necessary, and it was gracious. And if you let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, according to Colossians 3:16, when you open your mouth, that's what will come out too. And if the Lord sets a watch over your tongue, and if the Lord is the one who keeps your lips, yours can be the same. Check your words. Colossians, it talks about that our speech should be seasoned with salt. You know, there's a corruption in the world, and salt, we are to be salt to that. You know, when something would corrupt, they'd put salt on it, and salt would retard the corruption. What about when you talk? Are you a part of the corruption, or do you retard the corruption? Are you salt, or are you just more of the corruption? When you open your mouth, are you the salt that retards the corruption, or are you just part of the corruption? Something to think about. And the result of it all? Verse 30, grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you are sealed to the day of redemption. Did you know the Holy Spirit can get sad? That's what grieve means. And here the Spirit of God grieves. And what makes him grieve? What makes him grieve is when you as a believer don't exchange the old for the new. The Holy Spirit is grieved when he sees lying instead of the truth, when he sees anger instead of forgiveness, when he sees stealing instead of sharing, and when he hears corruption instead of graciousness. And the point that he's making in verse 30 is, how could you possibly grieve the Holy Spirit of God by whom you are sealed to the day of redemption? The idea that I want you to see here is this. When you were saved, the Spirit of God put a stamp on you that said, this is God's, this is genuine, this is authentic, and this is forever. And listen, if the Spirit of God has been so gracious as to give you an eternal salvation, if the Spirit of God has been so gracious as to seal you forever, if the Spirit of God is so gracious as to hold you in the palm of his hand till the day of redemption, how could you willfully grieve such a gracious Spirit? That's what he's saying. How could you do that?